Chapter 8. Like a Frog in a Pot. Once absent, the dysfunction resulting from Crystal's shenanigans quickly became a distant memory, as Ludlow Randolph returned to its goal of maximizing profitability. Promoting Christianity was good business, especially within Det's division of the company. As Benny's faithful vassal, Det always made his numbers. Det knew every television evangelist and influential church leader in America. Because Ludlow Randolph was a major player, he was welcomed with open arms wherever he went. Because Benny could be philanthropic whenever it suited him, cash-strapped ministries were constantly jockeying for position, relentlessly seeking a substantial donation. Few were given, but just the possibility that it might happen ensured Det's visits were ballyhooed as special occasions. Being Benny's surrogate made Det's job much easier and far more prestigious. His stature was inflated so disproportionately that, when he arrived at a ministry, he was treated as deferentially as a presidential ambassador. Such treatment was intoxicating to Ludlow Randolph's high school graduate. Det came to expect accolades, craving the attention like an addict needing a fix. He convinced himself such attention and accoutrement were appropriate and warranted, something akin to being his destiny. Ministries hoped to use their relationship with Det to influence Benny, but they had no idea with whom they were dealing. Once Det ingratiated himself into a ministry's inner circle, which required little effort, he began his search for like-minded people, those motivated by the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eye, and the boastful pride of life. And he always found them, lots of them. It was his special gift. When he did, he would focus on gaining that person's trust, his long-established and predictable pattern. As soon as this happened, he found a way to compromise the person. This is when circumstances would begin to change. Once he owned a piece of some unfortunate person's soul, Det would start exerting his influence, tilting the scales in his favor, creating an economic advantage for Ludlow Randolph, Benny, and himself, much to the delight of his benefactor in Orlando. Having been compromised in one way or the other, coupled with the fear of public exposure, followed by ridicule, the ministry representative would never be able to hold his or her ground in dealing with Det again. Weakened, this person would be emotionally coerced into agreeing to terms that were clearly not in the ministry's best interests. Knowing that people, whose souls were owned by him, could never negotiate from strength, Det leveraged the compromised person's trust to maximize his advantage. This was his purpose all along. In these situations, Det was routinely the victor. Despite the power differential between the abuser and his victim, Det was never heavy-handed. Instead, he remained deferential, which kept his prey constantly off balance. Det was smooth. He was never an outward bully. He wouldn't even consider being one. His methods were far too subtle for that. Being overtly confrontational was never his style. Instead, his influence was always exerted in smooth, calculating, and shrewd ways. When he was at a ministry, Det was consistently obsequious. His malice, which he carefully concealed, remained hidden just below the surface, camouflaged perfectly by a syrupy, disingenuous smile. To nearly everybody, he seemed like a benevolent, competent, and trustworthy servant of the Lord. Det knew what was happening, as did his victim. The person didn't realize it at first, of course, but eventually his or her compromised position became painfully clear. Other people in the ministry never comprehended what was happening. They were usually clueless. Their knowledge of negotiations remained superficial at best. They only knew what Det wanted them to know, nothing more. Because they were oblivious, their approving smiles were genuine, never forced or coerced. Being certain things were copacetic, ministry workers effectively convinced those who might have doubts that things were progressing smoothly. Det counted on this and used it to his advantage. Keeping people in the dark was essential. Just as he had done with me, he never allowed lesser mortals to see the situation for what it was. His ability to accomplish this effortlessly is what made his serpentine ways so effective. It's also why Benny consistently overlooked his devious misconduct. People trusted Det until his one-sided deal became a reality. This is when they realized how unfair it actually was. By then, however, there was nothing they could do to alter the situation. Like Faust, who struck a deal with Mephistopheles, those compromised by debt came to regret their candor as their worst nightmares came to fruition. To avoid exposure and perhaps even the loss of their positions, these unfortunates, people who trusted debt, agreed to terms that were disadvantageous to their ministry, effectively making their side the vanquished for the duration of the deal. Others, the rank-and-file workers in the ministry, who were oblivious throughout the negotiations, simply accepted their fate like good victims. They bemoaned their reversal of fortune, as they came to realize their efforts were building Benny's empire at Ludlow Randolph rather than the Lord's or their own. Seeing how this unfolded numerous times is how I came to realize who Debt really was. When I began working for him, he fooled me, just like he fooled everybody else. This didn't change until I began to piece together exactly how he operated, which required time, since he was so cunning. While I was still working at Ludlow Randolph, either Pete, AC, or I would set things up for Debt, just like we were the warm-up team, getting the crowd ready for the star's appearance. This was our job. We would make the preliminary effort, working out a book deal or a marketing venture between the ministry and Ludlow Randolph. We would provide the product. The ministry would provide the audience, either from TV viewers or from radio listeners. In theory, such an arrangement should have worked well, with everybody winning. When we had every facet of the agreement worked out, Debt would make his entrance to seal the deal. If it was large enough, Benny might even make an appearance, but his presence was rare. He preferred to allow Debt to be the bad cop. As president of Ludlow Randolph, it allowed him to maintain plausible deniability if things fell apart. More often than not, when Debt arrived, having compromised someone within the ministry, he would change the specifics of the agreement. This certainly wasn't what we wanted or expected, but it is what happened. It made us liars by proxy, which was deeply disturbing, especially since we were powerless to rectify the situation. I can't tell you how many times Debt embarrassed me by changing key points of an agreement I thought had already been finalized. It got to the place where I would ask Debt hard, direct questions about what to expect before I would even make the initial proposal. I wanted to be certain everything was as I had communicated it would be. Debt would promise the deal was straightforward and true, and his assurances were very convincing. Then, at the last minute, he would announce changes that had been made behind my back. He did the same thing to Pete and AC. It occurred repeatedly. I felt like Charlie Brown, trusting that Lucy would not pull the football away when he tried to kick it, but she always did, just like Debt did. Metaphorically, I landed on my derriere more often than not. Being in such a situation became increasingly untenable, but I also knew the problem was greater than what was happening at Ludlow Randolph. Pete and AC recognized this as well. Nothing was as it seemed to be at nearly every ministry we served. What we saw was a disturbing trend that was occurring across the fruited plain, a trend that required addressing, a pattern of darkness that needed to be exposed to the light. It's a problem that most people don't even realize exists. If they did, they would be appalled. In America, some people are so skeptical of religious leaders they refuse to give them a chance, choosing instead to ascribe ulterior motives to everything they do. Such people don't seem to be able to help themselves. Cynical by nature, they reject having faith in anything. I suppose it's just a part of their natures to be that way. There are many people like this, those who refuse to believe in anything other than themselves. They are the doubtful, the dubious, the distrustful, and the jaded. They refuse to be fooled, but by doing so, they also miss out on much of life's richness. Choosing to be cautious and suspicious, they never lower their guard about anything involving faith. There is another type of person, those whose natures allow them to believe freely and easily, perhaps too easily. It's why people refer to them as believers. Because it's in their nature to trust, they can also be easily hoodwinked, fooled by those they come to trust, by those who claim to speak for God. Unfortunately, their open-heartedness, which is a positive character quality, can be used against them, and it often is. The world is full of such people, and I'm one of them. Frequently, people like me choose to bury our heads in the sand when our leaders fail to meet acceptable standards of behavior. We refuse to call a spade a spade. When we finally recognize something is amiss, we don't speak out. Not at first, anyway. Most of the time, we don't make a conscious decision to behave this way. Instead, we simply drift along, trying to make the best out of a difficult situation, without overtly admitting how destructive it has become. Always thinking positively, trying to look at the glass half full, we accept behavior from our spiritual leaders we shouldn't. We make excuses for them to everybody, including ourselves. We behave like a frog in a pot of water. Before we realize how hot it has become, the water is boiling. Nefarious Christian ministries thrive on people like us because we routinely give our leaders a pass for conduct we would never tolerate in others. This is especially true when we work for them. As part of our unspoken job description, we are expected to hide the truth, to camouflage what is really happening behind the curtain, and to put a positive spin on questionable ethical behavior. Occasionally, we are even required to turn a blind eye to various forms of sexual deviancy. We do this to protect the religious leader and the ministry from suffering the natural consequences of inappropriate behavior. Without thinking through the ramifications, we tell ourselves we are protecting God's kingdom. But this is a mistake. We are deceiving ourselves. When we operate like this, our loyalty becomes our weakness rather than our strength. Even worse, we rarely perceive reality as we should. Not wanting to hurt the work of the Lord, we maintain a stiff upper lip while keeping our mouths shut, particularly about the aberrant behavior of our leaders behind closed doors. We act like a woman who believes it's her responsibility to protect her alcoholic husband from facing the legitimate consequences of his drunkenness. Our behavior could also be compared to that of a long-suffering wife of a scandalized politician, a woman who stands by her spouse at news conferences while he admits to being involved in adultery, homosexuality, or graft and corruption. By so doing, like these women, we believe we are validating the person, but not the behavior. Again, this is a mistake because the problem is usually much deeper than simply acting out. Essentially, we end up enabling the fox to return to the henhouse once minor penance has been satisfied. I know this is true. I'm not guessing. What I've witnessed over the years is not an isolated problem with a few ministries. It's much worse than that. What I came to realize is there is a cover-up mindset in America that is fully operational in numerous ministries, megachurches, and Christian publishing houses. For more than a quarter of a century, I have watched ministry staff go to elaborate lengths to shield duplicitous leaders, protecting them from being exposed to the light, sheltering them from facing the appropriate penalty for misbehaving. Recognizing the enormity of the problem required years for me to grasp. Once I did, though, it became far easier to understand the causal factors behind the problem. When I was younger, I couldn't understand why solid Christian people would participate in such conduct. It was a real mystery. That is, I didn't understand it until I realized I had become one of these people, when I began working for Alvin Detler Carter. Like others, I never made a conscious decision to do anything wrong or misleading. It just happened. Not knowing what else to do, I simply kept my mouth shut about Det's unethical escapades instead of speaking out, which was a mistake. Det knew this was what I would do, at least for a while. Knowing I had to support my family, he used my vulnerability to his advantage. This was my weak spot, the place that provided him the leverage he needed to exploit me. By knuckling under to his deviousness, knowing I couldn't miss a paycheck, I sold a piece of my soul. It's something I never intended to do, and I deeply regret my complicity. By the time I became fully aware of what was happening, the water in the pot was already boiling. I had become part of the problem, which, as you can imagine, is a painful admission for me to make. As I think about my situation, it reminds me of a commercial that aired many years ago. It hit the mark perfectly with its witty, profound message. Slightly dark, satirical, and irreverent, the commercial was thought-provoking while also being entertaining. It starts with half a dozen clean-cut, all-American grade schoolers announcing to us, the listening audience, what they want to be when they grow up. what their lifetime goals and aspirations are, expecting them to say they want to become doctors, teachers, engineers, or professional athletes. I was surprised by what they actually said. One 9-year-old girl proudly announced, "When I grow up, I want to be the office gossip." A 10-year-old followed with boyish bravado, "When I grow up, I want to be a brown-noser." The other kids made similar ignominious assertions. It was hysterical. I can't remember the product these kids were peddling, but I grinned from ear to ear each time I watched the commercial. The satire was obvious. Nobody sets his or her career goal to be cowardly, devious, or ingratiating, nor does anyone want to end up being a brown-noser. When young people enter the workplace, they have praiseworthy, high-minded goals. You can see it in their eyes when they graduate from high school and college. During nearly every commencement ceremony, those graduating listen to a successful businessman or politician pontificate about how the current generation has the unique ability to change the world, making it a better place for each of us, while at the same time accumulating substantial wealth to enjoy the good life. During the commencement, when you look from one smiling face to the next, you can see hope radiating from these young people. Coupled with their enthusiastic smiles, each graduate anticipates the future, believing he or she will produce noble, praiseworthy accomplishments. They are convinced their dreams will soon become a reality. All that is required to achieve their dream is hard work, performed honestly and honorably. Unfortunately for most, that's all it ever becomes, a dream. Reality is far different than what they believe it will be, making the commercial as poignant as it was funny. The real world produces far more brown-nosers than men and women who stand by their convictions, especially if negative consequences are certain to follow. This is no surprise, but if this dichotomy is true in the world of politics and business, the difference between aspirations and reality is even more pronounced for those who choose to serve Christ by working for ministries. Nearly all who pursue this path, the road less traveled, do so for altruistic reasons, sacrificing material gain as part of their noble calling. It just goes with the territory. They decide that fulfilling their dreams can be best accomplished by working for the Lord, which is a praiseworthy ambition. Serving Christ, however, also means being employed by the ministries, megachurches, and publishers that champion His name. This is where a huge disconnect occurs. Working for Christian leaders has little resemblance to what most envision life would be like serving the Lord. It's different, worlds apart really, but not in a healthy way. The stars of Christendom, those whose faces and voices are easily recognized by millions, bear little resemblance to the biblical version of Christ or the principles He taught. Somewhere along the way, the career path for many who have been chosen to lead takes a sharp turn from the biblical standard, producing an entitled mentality, elitist behavior, and a consumptive lifestyle most would consider antithetical to the desires of a servant of God. It was a lifestyle Benny enjoyed regularly, and one Det convinced himself he should possess as well. There is a story behind all of this that needs to be told, but my purpose is more than just to curse the darkness. Rather, I intend to offer hope to the millions who have been used, abused, and discarded, all in the name of God. To accomplish this, I will need to tell you a good bit about who I am. Like everybody, my story begins the day I was born. From day one, my challenge was about whether to accept authority or to challenge it, whether to speak out against abusiveness or simply keep my mouth shut. Obviously, I've landed on the side of speaking my mind, but becoming that person has required a lifetime of battling adversity.